A flight attendant slipped a plastic bag over a black CEO's face as his baby screamed helplessly, "What happened next will leave you speechless." He forced a plastic bag over a father's face as his baby screamed, certain his uniform would shield him. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The first thing Elias Corrin noticed was how quiet the cabin seemed, too quiet for a nearly full-night flight. The lights above glowed a soft, dim gold, casting long shadows across the rows of seats and illuminating the nervous shuffle of passengers settling in. Elias adjusted the strap of the infant carrier across his chest, the nylon pulling gently against his shoulder. Inside the carrier, his baby son, Jonah, shifted with a tiny sound, more a breath than a whimper. His small fists twitched just beneath his pale blue blanket, and Elias instinctively ran a steadying hand over the child's back. He didn't want attention tonight. Not the kind he was used to, the kind that came with being one of the few black CEOs in the tech world whose name echoed through industry panels and magazine articles. No polished suit, no entourage, just a dark windbreaker, clean sneakers, and a father traveling with his infant son. A man on a mission to close a deal that could secure the future of his company. That was the only spotlight Elias wanted now, one that landed firmly on progress, not on him. The cabin air smelled of overused filters and coffee grounds. As he reached up to stow the modest diaper bag into the overhead compartment, his eyes caught a figure watching him. A flight attendant, tall and wiry, with sunken cheeks and close-cut blonde hair, stood 2 rows down, arms loosely crossed. His name tag read Garrett Vale. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. Garrett's face didn't twitch, didn't blink. The expression wasn't quite disdain, it was colder than that. Detached. Calculating. Elias offered a nod out of habit, polite and neutral. Garrett didn't respond. He simply turned, his footsteps soundless on the carpet, and vanished toward the galley. Elias exhaled and slid into his seat beside the window. The leather was stiff, and the buckle clicked too loudly as he fastened it. Jonah shifted again, this time letting out a soft whimper, the kind that warned of an impending cry if not gently managed. Elias looked around, already feeling the familiar pressure of being watched. 2 rows ahead, a man with reading glasses glanced over his shoulder. A young boy across the aisle tugged at his father's sleeve, pointing at the baby. "Shh," Elias whispered, swaying slightly, patting Jonah's back with the rhythm of someone who'd done it 100 times in the middle of the night. "We're almost settled, buddy. Just rest, okay?" But Jonah's whimper turned into a sharper cry. It pierced through the cabin's hush like a dropped tray, startling and raw. Elias's hands moved with practiced grace, bottle already out of the side pocket, blanket shifted to cradle Jonah's head, but the cry continued, louder now, more urgent. From behind the curtain near the galley, Garrett reappeared. He approached with a practiced smile, the kind flight attendants wore when they were trying to appear helpful, but wished they were somewhere else. His footsteps were brisk, precise. He stopped beside Elias's row, crouching slightly to lean closer than necessary. "Sir," he said quietly, voice smooth but brittle, "would you mind tending to that?" "Other passengers are trying to settle in." "I am tending to it," Elias replied, matching Garrett's quiet tone but not his hostility. "He's just unsettled by the pressure. He'll calm down in a moment." Garrett's smile remained, but something flickered behind his eyes, a subtle tightening around the mouth, a flash of irritation. He straightened slowly and looked down at Jonah, who was now wailing in earnest. A few more heads turned. "You know," Garrett murmured, voice just low enough not to carry. "People pay good money to travel peacefully. Disruptions. They shift the atmosphere." Elias frowned, unsure whether he'd misheard. "Excuse me?" But Garrett was already walking away, not waiting for an answer. Elias's heart gave a quick, hollow thud. He'd faced tougher men than Garrett, investors who grinned while gutting startups, lawyers who sliced through contracts with smiles, but this was different. This was intimate. There was no boardroom here, no nameplate. Just him, a baby, and a flight attendant whose words carried something unspoken underneath. Jonah's cries began to soften as the plane's engines roared to life. The familiar pressure shift made Elias swallow hard. Outside, the tarmac lights passed in blurs as the aircraft pulled back from the gate. Flight announcements buzzed overhead. The hum of anticipation rose with the whine of the turbines. Elias tried to focus on calming his son, whispering softly, "We're all right. Just a few hours. Then we're there. I promise." He glanced out the window. Only darkness and the reflection of his own face, eyes tired but alert. As the wheels lifted off the runway, Garrett passed by again, this time pushing a service cart. Their eyes met once more, and the attendant offered a smile. But this one was different, forced, stiff, and hollow. He reached into the cart, paused for a moment, then slid a folded plastic bag between two cups. He looked at Elias, then looked away. Elias's breath hitched. It wasn't the action itself that alarmed him. It was the quiet intent. The way Garrett's fingers gripped the plastic bag, not like someone preparing coffee service, but like someone considering a darker use. The movement was small, too small for most to notice, but Elias noticed. He had learned long ago to read the room, to catch the expressions others missed. Jonas stirred again in his arms. Elias kissed the baby's forehead, trying to shake the unease that had now settled over him like a second skin. "You're safe," he whispered, unsure if the words were for Jonah or for himself. He looked across the aisle. Another attendant stood at the front of the cabin, arms folded, watching. Not moving, not smiling, just watching. Elias tightened the carrier strap around his shoulder again, every sense sharpening. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it. Every journey begins with a choice to trust the sky. The soft mechanical hum of the aircraft filled the cabin, a white noise that masked tension only to those not paying close attention. But Elias Corrin felt it, the subtle pressure in the air around him, the stiffness of the seatback against his spine, and the way eyes kept shifting toward his row and away again just as quickly. Jonah's whimpers had grown into sharper cries, the kind every parent feared on a plane. Not because of the inconvenience, but because of what followed. Judgment, dismissal, and, sometimes, hostility. Elias rocked the infant slowly against his chest, whispering low, rhythmic comforts into the child's ear. "We're okay, little man. Just a little air in your ears, that's all. Breathe with me." His voice was a soft cadence, the same one that had once steadied the nerves of investors during chaotic quarterly meetings. But in this dim cabin, high above the clouds, there was no boardroom formality to shield him. A shadow moved up the aisle, Garrett Vale, the tall, wiry flight attendant with a tight uniform and tighter smile. He approached like someone holding in contempt with every step, though his voice tried for cordiality. "Sir," he said, leaning slightly into Elias's space with a tilt of his head that came off more as a challenge than courtesy, "I think it would be best if you did something about the baby before this becomes a larger disturbance." Elias raised his eyes slowly, keeping his tone even. "I'm trying," he said simply. "He's reacting to the pressure change." "It'll pass." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Right. Well, we have other passengers trying to rest." Elias gave a slight nod, his jaw clenched as he returned his attention to Jonah. There was no need to escalate. Not yet. As Garrett walked away, Elias watched the man's posture, rigid, purposeful. Not tired, not flustered like most flight attendants during a busy flight, just tight. Too tight. Something about his stride carried an energy Elias didn't like. Still, he breathed deep and focused on Jonah, rubbing slow circles into the baby's back. The infant squirmed, letting out another piercing cry. A few passengers glanced up now, frowning, whispering behind hands. Elias whispered again, steady as a heartbeat. "You're okay. You're okay. Just ride it out, son." Then Garrett returned. He came bearing a clear plastic service bag, the kind used for air sickness, usually tucked into seat pockets. But this one wasn't folded. It was loose, thin, and crinkled faintly in his gloved hand. Garrett held it not with the casual grip of someone offering assistance, but with a stiffness that made the plastic tremble slightly in the cabin light. "There's always something we can do," Garrett said, his voice almost pleasant, but edged with something unnatural. Elias looked up, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" Garrett gestured slightly to Jonah, then to the bag, as if trying to maintain the illusion of customer service. "This can help. If he's congested, sometimes exposure to clean air can soothe infants. Happens more than you'd think." The explanation was strange, off in a way that felt rehearsed but meaningless, the kind of lie dressed up in just enough jargon to feel legitimate. Elias's fingers tightened instinctively around Jonah's side. "No, thank you. We're fine." Garrett's smile froze. "I'm just trying to help, sir." "So am I. Please leave us alone." Garrett didn't move right away. For a moment too long he stood there, still gripping the plastic bag with a hand that didn't tremble from nerves, but from restraint. His knuckles whitened, and his jaw tensed just slightly before he finally turned and walked back up the aisle. Elias let out a slow breath, calming himself before looking down at Jonah. The baby had settled slightly, but his face was red, and his tiny fists were balled tight. Elias gently stroked his son's back again, heart pounding beneath the surface of his collected exterior. His mind worked quickly now, layering observations over instincts. Garrett's glances, his tone, his insistence on control. The lack of empathy in his words, masked only by the thinnest veil of formality. And then the plastic bag. That detail lingered like smoke after a flame. Elias had dealt with competitors who smiled while plotting sabotage, with legal teams that disguised attacks as proposals. He knew how danger often dressed itself as help, and in this cabin, flying at 37,000 feet, something was wrong. He scanned the rows. A man across the aisle looked away quickly when their eyes met. A younger man in headphones kept filming casually with his phone angled toward the window, but Elias noticed the slight tilt toward his seat. Passengers were aware. Some were already watching. The tension was no longer about a crying child. It was about Elias himself. Jonah let out another scream, sharper this time, and Elias felt the sound crack like glass inside the fragile silence. But this wasn't just a baby reacting to pressure anymore. The scream felt like a warning, a signal, a breaking point approaching. Elias glanced once more down the aisle toward the galley where Garrett had disappeared, then to the small security camera above the emergency row light, unblinking. If this was being watched in real time by anyone on the ground, they hadn't intervened yet. Elias gently adjusted Jonah's position against his chest. The baby's breathing trembled, uncertain. His tiny hand clutched at Elias's shirt as if instinctively knowing something was off. And Elias understood now. This was no longer about comfort, no longer about a crying baby. It was about control, power, and silence. He shifted in his seat, every muscle in his body beginning to brace. Garrett would return. Elias could feel it. And next time, he wouldn't be holding just a bag. Sometimes danger comes disguised as service. Without warning, Garrett Vale slammed the plastic service bag down over Elias Corrin's face with a practiced, calculated force. It happened so fast that Elias barely had time to inhale before the thin material clung to his skin, suffocating him instantly. The world narrowed. The smell of cheap plastic invaded his nostrils, and all sound dulled except for the frantic pounding of his own heartbeat. His head snapped back against the seat as he instinctively jerked away, but Garrett pressed harder, his arm locked like a lever of restraint rather than assistance. Jonah's scream pierced the cabin, sharp, desperate. The baby's small legs kicked against Elias's chest, wriggling in his carrier, unaware of the full danger but sensing the terror in his father's body. Elias tried to shift, to lift his hands, but Garrett had the advantage, height, position, and surprise. The passengers in the surrounding rows gasped. One woman clutched her seatbelt as if bracing for impact, her mouth open but silent. A young man across the aisle fumbled with his phone, his hands trembling as he struggled to record. Someone muttered, "Is this real?" But no one moved. Not yet. Elias clawed at the bag, his fingers slipping uselessly across its surface. The plastic sucked to his skin with every breath he failed to take. His lungs screamed for air. The polished surface of the overhead bin glinted in the dim cabin light, mocking the civility of the setting. This wasn't happening in a dark alley or a war zone. This was first class on a commercial airline. Through the veil of suffocation, Garrett leaned close, his face inches from Elias's, his grin twisted and trembling with something unhinged. "You don't belong here," he hissed, voice low, venomous. "All your money, all your suits, none of it means a thing up here. Men like you think you're untouchable. But silence is earned, and yours is long overdue." His breath fogged the plastic as he spoke, the condensation mixing with Elias's panicked gasps. Every word landed like a blow. Elias's vision blurred at the edges, spots of darkness creeping in. But something deeper than fear surged in his chest, something louder than the panic and more powerful than the pain. Jonah's cries reached a fever pitch, loud enough to crack through Elias's haze. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the life pressed against his chest, for the boy who had only known safety in his father's arms. With a surge of willpower forged in the fires of hostile boardrooms and quiet betrayals, Elias twisted his shoulder, using the weight of his body to shift the balance. His left hand caught the edge of Garrett's arm, fingernails digging in. He bucked forward with a guttural sound, a mixture of fury and survival. The bag shifted, loosening just enough for Elias to inhale the smallest gasp of air, enough to fuel one last attempt. He ripped at the plastic, nails tearing through its seam, and light rushed back into his world as the bag fell away. His lungs expanded painfully, greedily. Garrett staggered back half a step, caught off guard by the force. Elias coughed, wheezing, but stayed upright. His right hand cradled Jonah, who was still crying, his small face blotched red. Elias looked at his son, then up at Garrett. "What is wrong with you?" Elias rasped. Garrett's grin faltered just slightly, but it wasn't shame, it was anticipation. He wasn't done. This wasn't a breakdown. This was planned. Then Elias saw it, just beyond Garrett's shoulder, reflected in the window beside him. A figure, another flight attendant. A tall man in his late 30s with neatly combed hair and a crisp uniform. He was watching, standing motionless in the narrow aisle. His eyes met Elias's through the reflection, and in that silent second, Elias understood something chilling. He wasn't intervening. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't even confused. He was waiting. The realization hit like a second blow. This wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. This wasn't just one unhinged man snapping under pressure. There was consent in the silence, power in the stillness. Elias's mind, still raw from lack of air, began racing. Who was this second attendant? Why wasn't he helping? Why did Garrett have the confidence to assault a passenger in plain view, in front of cameras and witnesses? Something deeper was at play. Something organized. Elias gritted his teeth, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not alone in this, are you?" Garrett didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the shadows of the cabin, Elias saw the truth unfolding like a puzzle missing only one final piece. Someone had allowed this to happen. Someone had approved it. And the longer the silence stretched, the more certain he became that this wasn't about Jonah's crying or Garrett's temper. This was about him. Elias Corrin, Black CEO, traveling alone with his infant son to secure a deal that would shift power away from those who already had too much of it. He thought he'd been careful, discreet, but someone had noticed, and someone wanted him quiet. Passengers continued murmuring, their voices rising slightly now. Phones recorded. Eyes watched. Yet the pressure in the cabin wasn't from the altitude anymore. It was from something invisible and dangerous that had infiltrated the very atmosphere. As Elias drew Jonah closer and locked eyes again with the silent flight attendant, his thoughts narrowed into a single point. Survive. Not just physically, but strategically. This wasn't over. The plastic bag had been the first move, not the last. He didn't know how many were involved. He didn't know what would come next. But the look in Garrett's eyes, smug, wounded, and still determined, told him that something worse was waiting, something that would test him even further. In that moment, Elias stopped thinking like a passenger. He started thinking like a strategist at war, because somewhere in the cabin's hush, he knew the assault had deeper roots than one man's cruelty. The mask of civility can hide the sharpest blade. Elias tore the plastic bag from his face with a violent jerk, his chest heaving, lungs desperate for air. The sound of the thin material ripping was swallowed by the thunder of blood in his ears and the sharp, panicked wail of Jonah pressed to his chest. For a second, Elias saw stars, flecks of light from oxygen deprivation dancing in the corners of his vision, but his grip tightened on his son, grounding him in the moment. The baby's tiny fists flailed helplessly, his cries rising in pitch. Elias turned his body slightly, shielding the child with his shoulder. He had barely recovered from the choking before Garrett lunged again, his face contorted not in panic or fear, but in grim purpose. The man's hand was raised high, as if the aggression had been approved, as if violence was part of his duty. Elias's instincts overrode thought. With a sharp pivot, he caught Garrett's wrist midair. There was a split second of resistance, then Elias twisted, driving the arm down and to the side in one fluid motion. A sickening crack echoed through the cabin, followed by a scream. Garrett collapsed to his knees, cradling his wrist, which now bent at an unnatural angle. The reaction was instant. A woman 3 rows back let out a sharp scream. A man nearby dropped his coffee cup, the ceramic shattering on the floor. Another passenger stood halfway, looking between Elias and the downed flight attendant with disbelief. Panic swept through the cabin like wind through dry grass. Quiet gasps, frantic voices, the rustling of people grabbing their phones and pressing record. Jonah continued to cry, his small body trembling. Elias shifted him slightly, pressing the baby closer, his own heart hammering beneath his ribs like a war drum. His eyes darted toward the galley where the second flight attendant, the one who had watched Garrett's initial attack without lifting a finger, stood frozen. His face was pale, expression unreadable. For a long, charged moment, he did nothing. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared behind the curtain toward the back of the plane. Elias's breath came in shallow bursts. He scanned the rows, taking in the stunned faces. Some were horrified. Some seemed more afraid of the commotion than the cause. No one moved to help. No one asked questions. And yet dozens of phones remained up, their tiny cameras capturing every second. "Stay calm," Elias whispered to Jonah, though the words were as much for himself. "You're okay. You're safe with me." But the lie stung in his throat. The look in Garrett's eyes wasn't of defeat. It was something far more disturbing, hatred laced with satisfaction, as if this moment had always been inevitable. Through clenched teeth, Garrett hissed something low and furious, barely audible over the baby's cries. Elias leaned in slightly, instinctively wary. "You don't know what you've done," Garrett muttered, sweat streaking down his temple. "You think you can walk through this world untouched. You think money, skin, titles protect you." He winced as a new wave of pain rolled through his body. "You were marked before you boarded." Elias pulled back, eyes narrowing. Those words settled into his mind like stones in water, rippling outward. Something deeper was at play. This wasn't the outburst of a single disturbed man. It was something calculated, coordinated. The way Garrett had approached him, the silence of the other attendant, the timing, nothing about it had been spontaneous. As Jonah's cries echoed like a siren, Elias's thoughts sharpened. He had weathered countless corporate betrayals and vicious boardroom ambushes. He'd learned to read what was not said, to see the movement behind the curtain. This was not about a crying baby. This was not about protocol. This was personal, or worse, professional. The cabin lights flickered briefly. A chime sounded. Then a low metallic voice from the cockpit spilled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are expecting some turbulence shortly. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened." The pilot's voice was calm, but Elias heard the strain underneath. It wasn't turbulence. Not now. Not after this. It was cover. Garrett still lay on the floor, crumpled yet strangely proud, like a man who had delivered his part in a larger plan. His broken wrist rested against his chest, but his eyes never left Elias. Not even when two male passengers stood slowly nearby, uncertain whether to help or retreat. Elias scanned the plane again, this time with purpose. His objective had changed. This was no longer about calming Jonah or diffusing conflict. It wasn't even about retaliation. It was about discovery. Who had given Garrett the confidence to attack a passenger, openly, physically, in front of a cabin full of witnesses? Why had the second attendant walked away without lifting a hand? Why had the pilot chimed in with a carefully timed message that felt more like a signal than a safety notice? Elias turned toward the overhead bins, noting the faint red glow of the emergency light panels. He could hear murmurs from the galley. Footsteps. A hushed voice on an intercom. Not the captain, someone else. Someone who didn't want to be heard. The lights flickered again. Jonah's breathing slowed, though the tears still streaked his cheeks. Elias rocked him gently, but his eyes never left the curtain where the second attendant had vanished. In the distance, the engines hummed steadily, masking the weight of rising danger. Something was coming. Elias could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This was not over. It had only begun. What breaks in one instant can unleash storms that last forever. The cabin shook with the weight of panic. Elias's arms wrapped tighter around Jonah, cradling the baby's head with one hand and bracing against the seatback with the other. The cries rising from his son's small chest were sharp and rhythmic now, each one cutting through the chaos like a signal flare. Oxygen masks hadn't dropped, but the air felt thin. Too thin. He could hear murmurs, gasps, and the frantic taps of passengers fumbling with their phones, recording, calling out, unsure whether they were witnessing a mental breakdown, a coordinated attack, or something even darker. Garrett Vale groaned on the floor, his broken wrist cradled against his chest, but he didn't look defeated. His eyes met Elias's with something more chilling than pain: resolve. A warning, quiet and full of venom. Elias had seen that look in corporate boardrooms, the expression of a man who hadn't lost, only been delayed. It struck him then that Garrett wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. No one assaults a CEO with a plastic bag mid-flight unless they believe there's a safety net waiting to catch them. Then came the intercom. A burst of static crackled above, followed by the pilot's voice, low, strained, far too measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering a rough patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." But the tone didn't match the words. Elias's ears caught something in the delivery, an odd pause before turbulence, a slightly slower pace than the usual flight announcement cadence. It wasn't a warning, it was a signal, a command. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. He instinctively turned toward the front of the cabin just as the second flight attendant reappeared from the galley. He wasn't empty-handed. In his grip was a red fire extinguisher, held not by its handle, but like a blunt weapon, ready to swing. The man, shorter than Garrett, stockier, with a buzzed haircut and narrowed eyes, hesitated only a moment before stepping down the aisle. His steps were stiff, controlled. His face was pale, but his knuckles were white from how tightly he held the metal cylinder. "Back off," Elias said, his voice even but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Don't come any closer." The man didn't speak. Instead, he scanned the cabin, watching the faces staring at him, most wide-eyed, a few angled behind phones still recording. His jaw twitched. Then he moved closer. Elias shifted, turning his body to keep Jonah shielded against the inside seat. His mind raced, scanning the layout of the aircraft, the locations of other passengers, possible exits. But there was nowhere to run, not 30,000 feet in the air. All he had was space, time, and the knowledge that someone wanted him gone. "Why are you doing this?" Elias asked sharply, his breath catching. "Who told you to come at me?" Still no answer. The man raised the fire extinguisher slightly, not quite high enough to strike, but high enough to threaten. Elias stood slowly, balancing against the rocking motion of the plane, one foot steady between the seats, the other braced behind. Behind the attacker, Garrett shifted on the ground and said something under his breath. Elias couldn't catch the words, but the tone dripped with loathing. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about hate, it was a mission, something calculated, something promised. A murmur rose behind Elias, a voice, maybe two, urging the crew to stop. A passenger shouted, "What's going on?" Another added, "Why isn't anyone helping him?" The tension was starting to crack open. Elias saw it. The passengers weren't all frozen anymore. They were watching, recording, whispering. Still, the second attendant pressed forward. Elias adjusted Jonah's position again. The baby was screaming, face flushed, tiny fists clenched as if fighting the air itself. The sound cut through every thought Elias tried to have. His brain felt like it was separating into two parts, one trying to hold his son together, the other trying to survive the attack. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Elias warned louder this time, "but if you step closer, I will defend my child." That finally gave the man pause. A long moment passed. Then Elias caught it, just for a second, a subtle glance from the attendant, past Elias's shoulder, toward the cockpit. That's when he knew. This wasn't random. This wasn't a rogue flight attendant having a breakdown. This was planned. Garrett hadn't attacked because of anger. He'd attacked because he was ordered to. And the orders weren't coming from him. They were coming from someone higher, someone who could crackle a false turbulence warning over the intercom, someone who had the authority to lock a cockpit door or unlock it. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His mind spun faster now, years of business battles sharpening into a single realization. This was a hit job, but not just to kill him, to make him vanish, to cover up the truth. But why? He searched the faces around him for allies, but most looked away. Some were horrified. A few raised phones still, but no one moved. No one stood. He understood. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for proof, for answers, for Jonah's right to a future unshaped by silence. The fire extinguisher dipped slightly in the man's hands. His eyes darted toward the cockpit again, foreshadowing a second wave, a larger plan. Elias swallowed hard, whispering to his son, "I've got you, Jonah. I've got you." His lips barely moved, but the promise burned through his lungs like fire. Around him, the cabin was a powder keg of tension, one spark away from erupting. Elias didn't know who else was involved or how far the conspiracy reached, but he knew one thing now with absolute certainty. Someone higher up had decided his life and his child's were expendable. The storm is fiercest when its source is hidden. The shouting began 2 rows behind Elias, sharp and scattered like sparks on dry kindling. A man in a gray hoodie stood and shouted at the crew to do something about this madness. Another, seated near the emergency exit, urged calm, his voice trembling. "Let's not panic. They'll land the plane if this gets worse." But the air had already changed. It no longer hummed with recycled calm, it crackled with rising fear. Phones were out in nearly every row now, red recording dots glowing faintly in the dim cabin. But in the middle of that tension, a subtle shift passed unnoticed by most. 3 men, seated apart in seemingly random rows, rose in eerie synchronization. Their movements were smooth, efficient, not the clumsy fidgeting of startled passengers. One adjusted his sleeve as he moved, revealing a glimpse of a communication device tucked beneath his cuff. Another placed a firm hand on the overhead compartment rail, eyes locked forward, scanning, not in panic, but in preparation. Elias noticed. His breath caught. The scream of adrenaline surged in his ears, louder than Jonah's cries, louder than the murmuring passengers. He gripped his son tighter, instinctively drawing him closer, shielding the small bundle with his forearm. His eyes darted between the men now closing in. Their expressions were blank, efficient, too focused, too calm. Not passengers, operatives. A cold clarity cut through his mind. He had seen this kind of movement before, in security briefings, private risk assessments when his company had received death threats during a high-profile acquisition. These weren't air marshals. These weren't civilians. They were planted, and they were here for him. The second attendant stepped forward from the galley, holding the fire extinguisher again, not to fight fire, but to block the aisle. His hand trembled just slightly, but his stance was firm. Elias's exit was sealed. The plane had become a trap. His chest rose and fell in sharp, silent breaths as he put the pieces together. The merger. Of course, the deal he was flying to finalize wasn't just another acquisition. It involved a security software platform designed for critical infrastructure, airports, banking systems, emergency communications. Whoever controlled it wouldn't just make billions, they'd control the gates to power itself. Could it be rival firms, disgruntled investors, a leak from inside his own boardroom? The questions flickered through his mind like flashbulbs, each possibility darker than the last. But one truth was crystal clear. This was never about a baby crying. This was a hit, staged with surgical precision under the guise of a passenger incident. The plastic bag, the attack, all of it was a test run, a soft lead-in to eliminate him before his plane even touched the runway. Garrett had tried to silence him in the open, not expecting a fight, and now that plan had escalated. The real operation had stepped forward. One of the men, a tall figure with salt and pepper stubble and dark tactical eyes, moved to the edge of Elias's row. He spoke low, just audible beneath the hum of panic and engine. "Don't resist," he said, almost kindly. "You don't want the boy hurt?" Elias didn't blink. His gaze stayed locked, his voice a whisper of steel. "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer, but the twitch in his brow betrayed the tension of a plan encountering resistance. He reached into his jacket, not for a gun, but for something worse. A syringe, capped in safety red. Quick, silent, efficient. They were going to make it look like a medical emergency. Elias's pulse thudded in his ears. Jonah whimpered, sensing the shift in his father's heartbeat. There was no more room for doubt. No one was coming to help. He was surrounded, boxed in, but not broken. He'd fought off hostile takeovers more complex than this. The battlefield had changed, but the rules remained the same. Identify the weak link, disrupt the plan, control the narrative. He shifted slightly in his seat, repositioning Jonah in the carrier. His fingers moved with practiced care, tightening the straps until the baby was secure against his chest. His other hand slid into the diaper bag near his feet, not for a weapon, but for his phone. He pressed the emergency stream button. The camera began recording live to his cloud. If he vanished, if something happened, the world would know. Across the aisle, one of the so-called passengers noticed and moved, but Elias's voice rang out, low but firm. Every second you wait, more people are watching. If I go silent, they'll know who did it." The plane rocked slightly in light turbulence, but no one paid it any mind. The captain hadn't spoken again. The silence from the cockpit was too convenient. The tall man's eyes narrowed. "You're making this worse for yourself." "No," Elias replied, his voice hardening. "I've already survived the worst." This, he motioned to the men, to the cameras, to the trembling passengers watching everything unfold. "This is just your failure playing out in public." The second attendant gripped the fire extinguisher tighter. The man with the syringe took a slow step forward. Elias knew he had seconds to act, not just to protect himself but to ensure Jonah lived past this flight. He scanned for an opening, a weak spot in their pattern. The aisle was blocked, the windows useless. But the moment of coordination that had brought the operatives to their feet was also their flaw. They moved as one, predictable, synchronized. If he disrupted their rhythm, even slightly, it could buy him time, enough time. He braced himself. A voice, distant, defiant, rose from the back of the cabin, a man yelling about the recordings, about sending them to the media. Elias didn't turn, but the momentary distraction worked. The man with the syringe hesitated. Elias met his gaze. "You don't want to do this," he said quietly. "You don't know what I've built. But if I die here, the world finds out everything." A pause, a flicker of indecision. The calm was cracking, and Elias felt it, like a thread unraveling in slow motion. He leaned back just slightly, eyes still locked on the enemy, heart pounding with a father's fear and a strategist's resolve. He wasn't finished yet. They had underestimated him once. They would not get the chance to do it again. The air was thin, but the lies were thicker. He thought choking a black CEO in front of his child would go unanswered. But justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The whisper came like a knife cloaked in silk. "If you value your child," the man said softly, "you'll keep quiet." Elias didn't flinch, but his heartbeat quickened. The operative's breath was steady, his words delivered with the same calmness as a man offering flight instructions or reading a menu. Yet beneath the surface, Elias heard it. The threat disguised as concern. The dominance coded in civility. He'd heard it before, not in airplanes but in corner offices where executives smiled while plotting takeovers. The tone was unmistakable. Power pretending to be polite. He shifted Jonah slightly, cradling the baby tighter against his chest. The infant's cries had softened to trembling gasps, his little fists twitching against Elias's shirt. The surrounding air had grown thinner somehow, not because of altitude, but because of intent. Something poisonous filled the cabin. Elias didn't respond to the threat right away. Instead, he looked around. 4 of the men, he could see it clearly now, weren't passengers. Their clothes were plain but coordinated. Their movements weren't casual, they were measured. 2 stood near the aisle ends, boxing him in. Another sat diagonally across, pretending to read a magazine that was upside down. The last one still loomed close, pretending to adjust his seatbelt. The illusion of normalcy was cracking at the edges. And the other passengers? Most were frozen in discomfort, some darting quick glances, others holding up their phones in half-hearted attempts to record. There was uncertainty in their eyes. No one knew what was happening, but they all knew something was wrong. Elias drew in a breath, not to calm himself, but to steady his voice. "These men," he said clearly, lifting his head so his voice carried, "are not passengers. They are operatives, and they're here for me." A beat of silence followed. No one moved. For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air, untouched. But then a ripple passed through the cabin, soft gasps, turning heads, blinking cameras snapping into focus. Eyes widened. Someone's hand went to their mouth. Another phone rose slowly, beginning to record. The man in front of him didn't blink, but his jaw shifted. The lie was slipping, and Elias had cracked the silence. "Sir, please sit down," the second flight attendant began, stepping forward from the galley, but his voice was strained. In his hand, he held the fire extinguisher. Not like a tool, like a weapon. Elias saw the shift in his shoulders, the faint tension in his knuckles. The man wasn't coming to help. He was coming to finish what Garrett started. The extinguisher swung. Elias moved first. Twisting his torso while shielding Jonah with one arm, he drove his shoulder forward, slamming into the attendant's chest. The blow knocked the man back into a row of seats with a dull thud, sending startled cries through the aisle. The extinguisher clattered to the floor, rolling beneath the legs of a woman who screamed and pulled her feet up in panic. "Someone help!" another passenger shouted. Jonah wailed now, the high-pitched sound raw and terrified. Elias felt the heat of the baby's breath against his neck, the tremor of panic through his small body. But instead of weakening Elias, it pushed something deeper awake in him, something fierce, something unbreakable. The man he'd struck groaned but began to rise. Behind him, the 4 operatives began to close in again. But they didn't rush him, not yet. The declaration had changed the room. Now eyes were watching. Now the operatives had to be careful. Elias straightened, clutching Jonah tightly. "If you're going to silence me," he said to no one and everyone, "you'll have to do it in front of them all." One of the men froze halfway through the aisle. His eyes flicked toward the raised phones, toward the glint of a red recording light. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were filming, documenting. A young man near the back raised his phone higher, his mouth set in a grim line. "You hearing this?" he whispered, holding the phone like a torch. "It's live." Elias caught it. A stream. The word lit a fuse in his mind. They weren't just recording. They were broadcasting. The operative who had whispered the threat earlier stepped back slightly, eyes darting across the cabin. The mask was cracking. Whatever control they thought they had was slipping through their fingers. But it wasn't over. With a grunt, the second attendant lunged again, diving for the extinguisher. Elias sidestepped, then kicked the canister with the toe of his shoe, sending it skidding under another row of seats. The man stumbled and hit his shoulder hard on the edge of a tray table, cursing under his breath as he scrambled to recover. Behind him, the operatives hesitated. They weren't trained for this. Not chaos under scrutiny. Their hesitation was Elias's window. He turned to face the cabin, voice firm and loud. "Everyone here," he said, eyes sweeping across frightened faces. "You're witnesses. Don't stop filming. Don't look away. If anything happens to me or my son, the world needs to know." A man near the front gave a quick nod, tapping furiously on his phone. Another whispered into his earpiece. From the corner of Elias's vision, he spotted the original flight attendant, Garrett, still crumpled in pain but watching with venom in his eyes. It wasn't over. Not yet. Jonah cried again, his little body trembling, but Elias whispered against his head, "I've got you. I promise." The operatives hadn't backed down completely, but their steps had slowed. They were calculating. They were afraid. Not of Elias, but of exposure. And Elias knew, with every breath, that this was his moment to turn the tide. "Fear multiplies in silence," he said aloud, not just for himself, but for the entire cabin. But truth shatters masks. Garrett's scream pierced the air as Elias's foot slammed down on his already broken wrist, a sickening crunch echoing across the cabin. The flight attendant howled in pain, his body writhing as the blade he'd hidden beneath his sleeve clattered onto the floor with a metallic ring. The passengers gasped collectively. The reality of the attack no longer something that could be ignored or denied. A visible weapon, no longer just rumors or suspicion, now lay on the cabin carpet like a silent confession. Elias stepped back, one arm holding Jonah close to his chest, the other raised defensively, his breath coming in short bursts. He scanned the faces around him. Many were still frozen in shock, but a few held up their phones, recording every second. Then a voice rang out, not fearful, but firm and deliberate. "I'm live streaming this to my family," shouted a passenger from the middle rows. Heads turned. It was a stocky, middle-aged man with graying temples and a dark green jacket. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from rage that had finally boiled over. "My name is Dorian Kale. I've got everything, every second since they attacked that man and his child." The tension cracked. The operatives, who had surrounded Elias moments earlier with quiet menace, now hesitated. Their eyes darted from Elias to the camera phones, then to each other. They had expected control. Now they had exposure. Elias locked eyes with Dorian and gave the smallest nod, gratitude wrapped in urgency. He knew that the illusion was unraveling. Still, he also knew that cornered threats were the most dangerous. Suddenly, a loud click echoed from the front of the plane. The cockpit door slid open. Every head turned. Out stepped Captain Rhys Maven. His pilot's uniform was crisp, his expression anything but. There was no confusion in his eyes, no concern for the safety of the passengers. His face was cold, controlled, calculated. "Captain," one of the passengers called out nervously, "please, you need to call for help. This crew's out of control." But the captain didn't acknowledge the voice. Instead, he walked slowly down the aisle with a military-like calm, stopping near Garrett's crumpled form. He scanned the cabin, eyes sweeping over the crowd like a man taking inventory. Then he looked directly at Elias. "No one expected you to resist this long," he said softly, almost like a teacher reprimanding a student who had disrupted a lesson. "But you've made this unnecessarily complicated." The operative stood a little straighter at his voice. The second flight attendant, still gripping the fire extinguisher, took a step forward. Elias felt the baby press closer to his chest, felt the rise and fall of Jonah's frightened breathing, the faint warmth of the child's cheeks against his shirt. It was a small tether to something pure amidst the growing darkness. He looked at the captain. "You were never flying this plane, were you?" he said. "You were piloting a plane." Captain Maven's mouth twitched, but he didn't respond directly. Instead, he turned to the operatives and gave the order with chilling clarity. "Finish this quickly before the storm outside forces a landing." The words weren't shouted. They weren't barked. They were delivered like a schedule update, and that made them even more terrifying. Elias's heart thudded violently. The phrase wasn't about turbulence at all. It was cover, a code. The flight path must have been altered, time carved away deliberately to keep the cabin in midair long enough for the plan to succeed. And now, with the attack failing publicly, the captain was trying to fast-forward the damage. Dorian shouted again, this time louder. "Everyone's seeing this. My wife's calling the authorities right now." But the captain didn't flinch. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, indifferent to the chaos behind him, leaving the mess to be cleaned up by those he had commanded. Elias took a step back, adjusting Jonah in his carrier, tightening the straps with practiced hands. His mind, sharpened by years of boardroom ambushes and legal maneuvering, was already racing ahead. This wasn't a scuffle. It was a sanctioned act, planned, rehearsed, and executed at 30,000 feet. Garrett groaned from the floor, mumbling through pain. "They said I'd be taken care of. After." Elias heard it. Everyone did. More proof that promises had been made, dark bargains struck in quiet corners. Yet now those promises lay fractured on the floor, much like Garrett himself. The passengers stirred uneasily, the earlier silence breaking into whispers and cries. Even the operatives looked less certain than they had minutes ago. Elias saw it in their eyes. Their mission hadn't ended. It had failed to remain hidden. And with the captain stepping back into the cockpit, leaving orders instead of resolution, the chain of command was clear and rotten. Elias didn't know how many more moves he had, but he knew one thing. He had to survive. For Jonah. For the truth. For every person on that plane who now realized they were pawns in something far bigger than delayed meals and seat assignments. And he also knew that time was running out. When leaders step into shadows, the light grows scarce. Elias repositioned Jonah in the chest carrier with steady, deliberate hands, tightening the straps across his back until they clicked firmly. The baby whimpered but didn't cry, his small hands curling near his father's shirt. Elias's own heart thudded with cold precision, not panic, but calculation. Garrett writhed on the cabin floor, cradling his broken wrist, muttering half-formed phrases that clawed at Elias's ears like shadows whispering from a corner. The lights above flickered once as if the plane itself hesitated. Elias stood tall in the aisle, surrounded. The operatives, 3 of them, had begun to move in again. Their eyes were alert, their steps coordinated, each one keeping their hands close to concealed weapons or restraints. Elias could see it now with perfect clarity. They had expected him to panic, to become the story they could shape, a violent disruption, a dangerous man, an incident on a flight. But he wasn't giving them that. His silence was over. "If this plane lands without me," Elias said, his voice low but ringing with certainty, "the world will know why." The words struck like a warning bell. Phones were still recording. He could see one clutched tightly in the trembling hand of a teenage boy near the wing rows. Another camera was visible across the aisle, pointed steadily from a man in his 40s whose shirt was stained with spilled coffee. Several passengers stared between Elias and the captain, caught between fear and awe. They had watched the attempted suffocation, the assault, and now, this. Captain Reese stood at the front of the cabin, hands gripping the overhead support rail, his expression cracking. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. The power dynamic had shifted, and Elias had become the center of gravity. One of the operatives, a clean-shaven man with gray at his temples, hesitated. He wasn't confused. He was calculating risk. Elias knew that look well. It was the same expression that Wall Street executives wore before a high-stakes merger collapsed. A man doing math, measuring consequences. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," the man said finally, his voice controlled, almost clinical. Elias didn't blink. "Hard for who?" Jonah stirred. Elias gently shifted his weight, keeping one arm free, the other protectively curled near the baby's back. Every movement now was both defensive and deliberate, as if choreographed for survival. Behind him, Garrett let out a sharp breath and mumbled something incoherent. Elias turned, barely able to hear it at first. But then the words became clearer. "They promised me, said it'd be easy, just a choke, just a flight." His voice cracked, not with pain, but with confusion. It wasn't just about hate, it was about a deal, one that had gone wrong. Elias stepped closer, staring down at the man who had tried to kill him. "Who promised you?" he asked, his voice a thread of steel. Garrett's eyes fluttered, red-rimmed, still twisted with defiance but now touched with doubt. "Said I'd be taken care of. If it worked. If you didn't make it." The air in the cabin grew heavier, like a pressure before a storm. Passengers looked at each other, realization dawning that this wasn't random violence, it was targeted, calculated. Elias returned his gaze to the captain, whose jaw now tensed hard enough to tremble. "You heard him," Elias said, lifting his voice again so the cameras could catch every word. "This wasn't an accident. This wasn't turbulence, this was planned." The older operative stepped forward again, this time slower, his hands outstretched slightly, palms open. "You've made your point," he said. "But if you care about your child, you'll sit down and let us handle this before things get worse." Elias narrowed his eyes. "Worse for who?" The man didn't answer. Elias looked to the nearest phone still recording. "They want silence." "But silence is not what they're getting. If anything happens to me or my son, every camera here makes sure the world knows." He could see the falter ripple across their faces now. Uncertainty. Fear not of him, but of the consequence they hadn't calculated. Exposure. Behind the operatives, the second flight attendant leaned out from the galley, clutching the fire extinguisher still, but his grip had changed. No longer tight with certainty, now awkward, trembling. He looked to the captain, awaiting orders, but the captain had none. Elias's mind spun. One more move, and he could shift the momentum entirely. He scanned the cabin, the phones, the expressions, the unlocked exit doors, not to open, but to signal. Every possibility was a chess piece. He stepped toward the galley just slightly, enough to unsettle them, to test the waters. The captain spoke, finally. "Sit down, Mr. Corrin." Elias stopped. Then he said, calm but unrelenting, "No." The silence that followed was profound. Passengers waited. The operatives stalled. Even Jonah, sensing the shift, had gone quiet in his chest carrier, listening to the beat of his father's heart. Elias's plan was no longer just about resistance. It was about exposure. Buying time until one of those cameras, one of those brave bystanders, got the footage out. Garrett moaned again from the floor. The cabin lights dimmed briefly as the plane adjusted altitude. A low tone chimed overhead. Elias looked toward the front of the aircraft, feeling the shift in atmosphere. Something was about to give. He knew this wasn't the end, but it was the edge of something. The edge of unraveling plans. The edge of truth forcing its way through. He adjusted Jonah gently, pressing his lips to the baby's forehead, whispering nothing, just breathing in his son's scent, anchoring himself. Then he turned again to face the aisle, voice firm, stance solid. In the balance of one father's choice lay the weight of truth. The second the captain barked his order, the cabin transformed into a fragile pressure cooker on the brink of explosion. Elias didn't wait. The fire in his chest had already reached its peak. With Jonah bound tightly against him, Elias surged forward, his arm locking behind a nearby food cart. The metal wheels shrieked against the cabin floor as he shoved it with all the force his body could summon. The clattering cart barreled down the narrow aisle like a battering ram, slamming into one of the operatives just as the man reached for something beneath his jacket. The impact hurled him sideways, his shoulder crashing into the wall with a thud that silenced the row beside him. Another man lunged at Elias's flank, fingers outstretched to seize his arm, but adrenaline surged like lightning through Elias's limbs. He twisted, driving his elbow into the man's midsection, knocking the breath from him. Jonah whimpered, sensing the chaos, his small hands clutching instinctively at Elias's shirt. Elias murmured under his breath, "I've got you," even as his eyes never left the looming figure of the second flight attendant charging forward with the fire extinguisher raised like a war club. There was no time for precision. As the metal cylinder arced through the air, Elias ducked and lunged sideways. The extinguisher struck the edge of a seat instead of his skull, bursting a section of plastic into jagged shards. The cabin echoed with the sound of splintered materials and shocked gasps. Passengers cowered, some huddling beneath seats, others holding their phones higher, capturing every blurry, shaking second. The lens had become their last refuge, a silent plea to the world to witness, to understand. Captain Reese's voice cut through the din, sharp and desperate. "Subdue him!" Now. But no one moved. The men who had once followed orders with robotic efficiency now hesitated. Their confidence had fractured beneath the weight of Elias's defiance and the realization that dozens of phones were still rolling, still live. In the captain's eyes, Elias saw the flicker of doubt, of a man who had expected submission and found rebellion instead. Sweat poured into Elias's eyes. He adjusted Jonah again, shielding the baby's head as he stepped forward with purpose, scanning the floor for the figure who had started all of it. Garrett. The wiry flight attendant lay propped against the side of a seat near the emergency exit, his face twisted in pain, cradling his shattered wrist. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, but the venom in his eyes hadn't dulled. He looked up at Elias and muttered something inaudible, his lips curling into the ghost of a smirk. That smirk was the final fracture. Elias approached slowly, each step calculated, deliberate. The others held their breath. One of the operatives began to lift his arm, then stopped. The balance had shifted. Elias no longer looked like a target. He looked like a storm. "I warned you," Elias said quietly, voice like stone. "I gave you every chance to stop." Garrett chuckled weakly, blood painting one side of his mouth. "You don't belong here," he hissed, eyes wide as if still clinging to some twisted mission. "You were never—" Elias silenced him. With one swift, brutal movement, Elias gripped the sides of Garrett's head and twisted. The snap was clean. Final. Garrett's body slumped and his smirk disappeared forever. The cabin plunged into stillness. Not a word. Not a breath. Only Jonah's sobs broke the silence, small and human in the midst of it all. Around them, passengers stared, not just in fear or shock, but something else. Respect. Gratitude. The man they had watched suffocate, fight, and rise again had done what none of them dared. He had ended it. The operatives did not move. They stood like statues, hands visible, uncertain of their next step. Captain Reese's voice caught in his throat. He took a step back toward the cockpit, his authority in tatters. Across the aisle, a man lifted his phone high, whispering, "The world saw everything." Elias remained still, breathing hard, his hands trembling now that the storm had passed. He cradled Jonah tighter, the weight of what had happened settling into his bones. But his eyes never lowered. He knew this was not the end. The silence was only temporary. More would come. More would rise from the ashes of this moment. But Garrett Vale would not. And with that truth, Elias spoke the words that sealed the chapter, steady and unflinching. The breaking point had come, and with it, the truth no longer whispered. Garrett's lifeless body collapsed against the wall of the galley, his head twisted unnaturally to the side. For a long, harrowing moment, the cabin froze in place. A silence so thick it seemed to smother even the hum of the engines blanketed the rows of passengers. Jonah's sobs echoed across the plane, sharp and heartbreaking, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. Elias stood in the aisle, chest heaving, his arms instinctively curled around the baby strapped to him. His right hand trembled, not from fear, but from the aftermath of a necessary act. The motion that had saved them, that had stopped Garrett, had drained something out of him, and yet filled him with something else, unshakable resolve. Across the cabin, eyes locked on him, not with judgment but with a complicated blend of awe and disbelief. The man who moments ago had been under attack was now standing like a shield, bruised but unbroken. A murmur started among the passengers, a quiet rustle of shifting bodies and whispered voices. Some still clutched their phones, screens lit, cameras rolling. The operatives, 3 of them, remained tense, now noticeably shaken. They glanced at one another, their earlier confidence replaced by uncertainty. The death of Garrett had thrown their plan into disarray. Orders, if still in effect, now carried consequences. No longer protected by anonymity, their masks were cracking. Captain Reese, still standing near the cockpit entrance, took one step forward. His voice broke through the silence like a stone dropped into water. "Return to your seats," he said, forcing authority into each syllable. "We will regain control of the situation." "No," Elias cut in, loud and steady, his voice carrying across the entire cabin. "You've lost control the moment you let him try to kill me." He took a single step forward. Jonah's sobs had softened now into short, hiccuping breaths, the baby's face buried against his father's chest. The captain faltered, momentarily taken aback by Elias's composure. His lips parted, searching for a response, but none came. Instead, a new voice rose from the back. "I've been live streaming since the attack," shouted a passenger, Dorian Kale, the middle-aged man with thick glasses and a gray windbreaker. He stood up fully now, raising his phone high like a torch in a dark cave. "My wife's watching this in real time. So is her sister. So are hundreds more by now." A ripple of gasps traveled through the rows. Passengers who had remained frozen now shifted, emboldened by Dorian's act. One man turned his phone screen outward, confirming the stream with a row of heart and angry face icons cascading upward. Another added, "I've got it too." Everything from the start, Elias's heart pounded, not just from adrenaline, but from hope. Eyes that once turned away in discomfort were now bearing witness. The assault was no longer a secret. It was a spotlight, and the truth had stepped into it. The operatives stiffened. The man closest to Elias, square-jawed with a buzz cut, took half a step back. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The one beside him clenched his jaw, his eyes flicking toward the cockpit, waiting for an order that didn't come. Captain Reese's face hardened. "This footage will be taken out of context," he said, quieter now, though his voice wavered. "You're endangering everyone on board." "I didn't put anyone in danger," Elias replied, never breaking eye contact. "You did when you made this cabin a battleground." "I only defended my son." There was no rage in his voice, only truth, and truth, when spoken with clarity, echoed louder than any command. One of the operatives shifted again, this time with visible uncertainty. He leaned slightly toward the aisle wall, lowering his head like a dog sensing the leash snapping. The air around them grew tighter. From the overhead bin above Elias, a baby's rattle fell to the floor with a small clink, unnoticed until now. Elias bent to pick it up, the act strangely human amidst the tension. He tucked it gently back into the side of Jonah's carrier. The moment was real, raw, and for the first time since the attack began, the operatives realized they were no longer operating in the dark. The entire world was watching. "They know now," Dorian said quietly, though it carried far. "They know what you tried to do." That was the fracture. The operatives' will broke, not with a cry, not with a retreat, but with a slow, collective step back. One by one, they withdrew, melting into the seats, abandoning their positions. Not in surrender, but in failure. Captain Reese stood frozen, his face locked in an expression that could not decide between denial and dread. His command meant nothing now. The uniform, the stripes, the rank, they were just fabric. Elias had taken back control, not by shouting, not by violence, but by surviving. As the cabin settled into a cautious stillness, Elias stood taller, Jonah cradled against him. Sweat glistened on his brow, his chest rising and falling in deep, heavy breaths. The passengers who had once glanced at him in silence now looked on with recognition of the truth, of the courage, of the strength that had filled the aisle. Yet Elias knew the threat had only retreated, not vanished. The attack had been part of something larger, an invisible machine grinding forward in the shadows. These men, the pilot, even Garrett, they were cogs. But for now, in this narrow tube of steel above the clouds, Elias had reclaimed his voice. The baby against his chest had cried not only for fear, but for defiance, and those cries had not gone unheard. He looked down at Jonah and whispered softly, "We're not done." Then he looked back up, jaw set, as if daring the sky itself to try again. Victory is never silent. It speaks in the gasp of those who survive. The emergency landing jolted the cabin with a violent thud. Tires screeched against the tarmac as the aircraft rocked sharply, metal groaning under the strain. The oxygen masks hadn't dropped, but the panic in the cabin clung to every passenger like a second skin. Red and blue lights flooded through the small windows as the plane taxied to a rough stop at the far end of Westbridge Airfield. Even before the engines powered down, armored security vehicles pulled up around the aircraft like a trap snapping shut. Elias Corrin didn't unclasp the carrier straps. Jonah was still pressed against his chest, his tiny frame trembling from the chaos and noise. Elias whispered to him, soft, steady, and calm, not because he believed the storm had passed, but because he knew a new one was forming. The cabin door opened with a hiss, and cold night air swept in, mixing with the electric tension already thick inside. Uniformed ground officers boarded quickly, 6 men, all in black jackets with Halver air security patches on their shoulders. Their movements were coordinated, their expressions unreadable. But Elias saw what the cameras might not. They weren't here to rescue. They were here to control. "Sir, put the baby down and raise your hands," one of them ordered, stepping forward. His tone was clipped, and his eyes never softened, not even at the sight of Jonah's tear-streaked face. Elias stayed seated. "I have evidence. Videos. Witnesses. I protected my child and myself from a coordinated attack by your crew and covert operatives on this plane. I'm not putting my son down." The officer frowned, then motioned to the others. "You're being detained for questioning in connection to a mid-flight disturbance. Injuries were sustained." There it was, the twist Elias had expected. The narrative was shifting. It didn't matter that he had been suffocated with a plastic bag, assaulted with a fire extinguisher, or threatened with knives. To them, he was the problem. Before any of the officers could step forward, a voice cut through the tense standoff. "I've got it all on video," Dorian Kale shouted from row 12, holding his phone aloft. "The whole thing is live, streamed to my family and saved to the cloud. You want to detain someone? Detain the flight crew who tried to kill a man with a child in his arms." Other passengers murmured in agreement. Several raised their phones. A teenager down the aisle chimed in. "My brother's a lawyer. He's already sent the video to news outlets." Elias looked around the cabin. Faces that had been frozen in fear now looked emboldened. The tide was turning again. One of the security men hesitated, glancing at his earpiece. A beat passed. Then another officer stepped forward, slower this time, more careful. "We need to escort you off the aircraft, sir." "Please cooperate," he said, but his tone was different now. Cautious, wary of the cameras pointed in every direction. Elias stood, still cradling Jonah. "Then I walk with my son. I don't give him up, not after what just happened." Outside, floodlights illuminated the tarmac like a prison yard. A news van had already breached the outer perimeter. Journalists with boom mics and cameras fought the security perimeter. One even shouted through a loudspeaker, "Is it true? The CEO of Corrin Systems was assaulted on board by crew?" Elias stepped into the cold night air, his shoes crunching against gravel scattered over the tarmac. Around him, passengers poured out behind, many still filming, still narrating the events to their followers and families. A Halver Air executive in a long coat approached, flanked by 2 men in suits. He wore a practiced smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Corrin," the executive began, "I'm sure we can sort this out quickly. There's been some confusion. Our priority is the safety of all passengers." Elias turned, voice steady. "Confusion would be turbulence. This was attempted murder. Your crew tried to kill me in front of my child, and now you're trying to rewrite the story before the ink has even dried." One of the suited men whispered something into the executive's ear. The man paled slightly and adjusted his tie. "We're reviewing all available footage," the executive replied carefully. "If there was misconduct, it will be addressed internally." "That's not your decision anymore," Elias said, eyes locking on the nearest camera. "This isn't just internal. The public's already watching. The evidence is everywhere." A faint cry from Jonah brought Elias back to the moment. He adjusted the carrier gently, rubbing Jonah's back with quiet reassurance. In the distance, another van rolled up. The Department of Aviation's legal branch, summoned not by Halvir but by the groundswell of media coverage and live footage now flooding the internet. Elias's phone buzzed in his pocket, his lawyer's name lighting the screen. Before the executive could say another word, one of the officers who had earlier moved to detain Elias suddenly changed direction, now speaking hurriedly into a radio. Headquarters says to stand down. There's a federal review incoming. Orders are to preserve all witness accounts and avoid escalation. Elias didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded. The storm hadn't passed. It had just changed form. News crews descended, and within hours networks across the country were cycling the footage. A father defending his child in the air against a conspiracy at 30,000 feet. And as Elias was escorted, not detained, into the terminal, surrounded by allies and enemies alike, he knew this battle was far from over. The aircraft might have landed, but the fight was just beginning, one that would move from runways to courtrooms, from camera phones to federal investigations. His grip on Jonah tightened. The baby, now asleep, didn't know how close danger had come, or how fierce his father had fought to push it back. The terminal doors slid open. When truth touches the ground, it demands to be carried further. The hearing room fell into a hush as Elias Corrin stepped forward. The panel of government officials sat behind a long wooden bench, their faces unreadable, save for one commissioner whose jaw tensed ever so slightly when Elias entered. Cameras clicked quietly from the press box. The atmosphere felt clinical and cold. Gray walls, fluorescent lighting, the air scrubbed of emotion. Yet underneath the silence hummed tension, not just the memory of what had happened on that flight, but the uncomfortable weight of what it revealed. Elias adjusted the lapels of his Navy suit and nodded once to the lead investigator, a silver-haired man named Director Wendell Crane. The man had been tasked with overseeing the investigation into Halvir Air's operations after the mid-air attack that stunned the nation. Elias felt the familiar heat of scrutiny on his skin, but it no longer unnerved him. His fear had burned away in the cabin of that plane. What remained now was resolve. "Mr. Corrin," Crane began, his voice low but firm, "the panel acknowledges your presence and testimony. We understand you have additional evidence to present." Elias stepped up to the microphone, eyes scanning the room, past the commissioners, the military consultant in the corner, the corporate observers planted near the exit. But it was the front row he focused on. Two Halvir executives, seated with hands clasped, pretending to observe out of concern. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but Elias could see the flicker of tension behind their eyes. They hadn't expected him to survive, much less testify. "I do," Elias said, his voice steady, "and I will start by saying this. What happened on Flight 417 wasn't an isolated event. It was the result of a system that rewards silence and punishes accountability." Gasps rippled through the room, barely contained. Elias placed a small device on the table before him. With a press of a button, the audio began to play. A quiet conversation, fuzzy but unmistakable. "If he doesn't land in Greyston, the merger dies. You want the deal? Take care of the distraction. The captain's on board?" The voice belonged to someone unknown, but the implication was chilling. The panel members exchanged glances. Elias continued. "That was recorded 2 days before the flight. I received it from a whistleblower inside Halvir's security branch, the same whistleblower who later disappeared without explanation." His words landed like a blow. Director Crane leaned forward, fingers tented. "Are you saying senior executives ordered this attack?" Elias didn't blink. "I'm saying I was targeted because of what I represent. A black CEO on the verge of securing a deal that would have shifted the power dynamic in the cybersecurity sector. My company, CoreSec Dynamics, developed quantum-level encryption for financial infrastructures. The deal I was traveling to close would have placed my firm in charge of safeguarding digital assets for over 60 nations. Certain people wanted that stopped." A murmur erupted in the room. Crane banged his gavel once. "Order. Continue," Mr. Corrin. Elias nodded. "Garrett Vale, the flight attendant who attacked me, was promised a stake in one of my rival firms. That promise was written in a document signed by a shell subsidiary of a company owned by Zendor Capital, an entity tied to Halvir's board through 2 intermediaries. Captain Rhys Maven had been receiving monthly consulting bonuses for over a year. His bank records are now in your possession." He paused. The commissioners were silent now, still, but no longer neutral. Their eyes sharpened. Elias continued. This wasn't just an assault on me. It was an attempt to silence an entire movement of independence, of disruption, to a system that prefers obedience to innovation. One of the panelists, a young investigator named Nolan Fay, cleared his throat. And what about your son, Jonah? Elias's jaw clenched slightly at the mention of his child. He took a breath. He cried during the assault. Many dismissed it as background noise, but to me, his cry was a call to act, a reminder that my responsibility wasn't just to survive, but to protect the future, his and others like him. His voice softened. You asked if I have more evidence. I do, but more than that, I have a question for every man sitting in this room. What are we if we allow the skies, our supposed symbol of progress, to become hunting grounds for power and control? The words lingered in the air like smoke. Director Crane sat back in his chair. Behind him, the doors opened quietly as a clerk entered, handing over a file. Crane read a note inside, then looked back at Elias. There's a sealed indictment here, he said slowly. 3 Halver executives are being detained as we speak. Your testimony expedited the process. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery. The executives in the front row stiffened, and security officers moved toward them without a word. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't smile, either. There was no triumph in justice long overdue, only necessity. As the officers led the men away, Crane turned once more to Elias. The panel thanks you. But you understand, this is just the beginning. Elias nodded once, calm but firm. I do. I've faced boardroom betrayals, sabotage, even death, but I will keep speaking, because silence is what let this system grow in the dark. In the back row, a journalist scribbled rapidly. A military advisor whispered to another. The tide had turned, but Elias knew too well that tides rise and fall. As he stepped down from the stand, Jonah's face came to mind. His son, small and trembling in that pressurized cabin, his cries a reminder of everything at stake. He adjusted his jacket and walked toward the exit, surrounded by camera flashes and whispers, his resolve intact. The sky had tried to choke him, but he rose higher than ever before. Seconds later, the father tore free. The same bag was ripped away and turned against his attacker. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It dramatizes themes of racism, abuse of power, and the urgent need for accountability in situations where authority is misused. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark reflection, and inspire action against discrimination and violence in all forms.